The In many ways, what we'll be doing is we're going to integrate a story that a lot of people kind of. We have two approaches to the Bible. I find regularly. We have four accounts of the life of Jesus, and I meet people who they kind of have each account and they get to know them really well, but they kind of consider each account in its own terms. And so and they never try to sort of fit them together. It can sometimes be a bit hard work, but they never try to fit them together. Sometimes people then try to fit them together and find actually it's not always that straightforward. And then they can get a bit kind of cynical and a bit blasé, and it's kind of a bit rough and so on. And I found neither thing particularly satisfying, because I want it to matter. I want history to matter. And I want to be able to understand the narratives and the text that the gospel writers have brought us. And so driving this kind of exercise, as I've gone through it over the years, is a desire to integrate and harmonize, to see how the gospels all fit together to produce a single kind of three-dimensional view of Jesus. But the pure details of why exactly one element kind of is in a different order to another and so on, those can be a bit tedious. And yet what we have here is this really incredible and exciting story. And so I want to kind of make sure we kind of somehow try and blend the two. So my prayer and my hope is that that actually you find that the story is interesting, not just interesting because in one sense it's a story we all know, but actually there are details in the story that oh, that's different. I hadn't seen that. I hadn't thought of it that way. That's a real hope. And at the flip side is that there's enough structure that you can have confidence, even if sometimes you look at them, and I don't blame anyone for saying this, but you look at it and say, I'm not quite sure why that's gone here and rather than there. That's fine. I've tried to kind of give you background in all of the notes we've got, but actually there's a kind of confidence that comes when you see how things do fit together. So we're going to as we go through these next 6 weeks, we're going to explore the people, the places, the prophecies, as well as the practice of Judaism that actually end up shaping the story. And to use a little phrase that I like, I think I put it in one of my books, and I liked it so much I use it all the time. That the story of Easter, the cross, is an eternal event that happens in history, and as such, it's unique. It's not, if you like, something that happens in history that modelled something that was eternal. It's almost as if eternity actually kind of breaks in and happens within our history, within our time frame. So it's this remarkable event as we believe in it as Christians. We didn't fully get our heads around everything that it meant when we first started following Jesus. We first started following Jesus, as people always have done, not because they have the full kind of technical story, the full theology. We started following him because there was something that felt true when we encountered something of either the story of the cross or through prayer. We experienced something that felt real and we needed to pursue it. And as we pursue it, we become more confident and we add things to our understanding. And so in the end, we come to a point where we can stand back on it and say, this is how I see these events. It may not be easy to prove to someone who's just starting that journey, but this is where I've got to as I look at it. So my prayer is that we go deeper in that process while we're together. So I've thrown a couple of these in at the beginning. We'll probably do some every week. When you're revisiting, I'm calling these meditation points. So I just put, that his story is a myth story in history. And by that, what I mean is that we have the story of Jesus. And some people look at the story and for instance, people like the popular kind of psychologist Jordan Peterson will talk about how the story of Jesus kind of embodies every sort of deep myth that humanity needs to live by. So it is a myth story, but actually it's one that really happens in history. And actually he quotes often C.S. Lewis, who gave me one of my favourite quotes, that when part of his own conversion was when he realised that the story of Jesus, which he could understand as a myth, was actually something that was unique because it was a myth. It was like a myth, but it happened in history. What I mean by like a myth is that it somehow, as I look at it and I reflect on it, I see deeper meanings in it than just the events. That's what a myth is about. But most myths are made up. But this is one that was actually lived. And so there's something of that as we come into this process that we don't ever want to forget. It's not simply history. It's not simply Jesus' story, a religious story, and it's not simply a myth story, but somehow it's all of those things. And we look at it in different ways, and we will encounter and we'll see different things in the events as we go through them. And so I just, as I say, I kind of leave it there. You can come back to this and look in the watch the video, see this slide, or see it in your notes, just as something worth meditating on. So this week, preparing for Passover, we're going to look at the first part of Jesus' week. In the notes I sent out, I said we'll be looking up until Monday night. As I put the things together, I've decided we're just going to go up to Sunday night. So that's fine. The notes you've got, it doesn't mess up what we do on each week. It's just I figured we wouldn't actually finish up to the end of Monday night comfortably if we did that. So we're just going to kind of unpack the story up to the end of Sunday night. So from Friday to Sunday. During that period, Jesus is based in Bethany. You will often, if you open the back of your Bibles, you'll see a little map or whatever, and you see Bethany just outside of Jerusalem. Sometimes you'll see another Bethany on the other side of the Jordan. Just to kind of flag, that is something that they put on the maps, but we don't actually know where it is. And it's not normally in a place where I think it probably is. So there are two Bethanys sometimes on your maps. One is on the far side of the Jordan, and that's a bit speculative. They just stick it in a place where you can cross the Jordan, but we don't actually know of where that place is. It's a speculated place. Whereas the Bethany just outside of Jerusalem is very real. So it's just about 2 miles away. So you head out of Jerusalem. You see this wonderful picture. This was actually drawn by my son when he was about 14, because I was looking for a copyright-free version of a map of Jerusalem that I could use for my live presentation on this. We used to put them on everyone's table, and you could move characters around on the maps. So I'm still using it because it's still copyright-free because Joel did it. It may not be the prettiest map to look at, but it works. And we will use some other images as well as we go through tonight. So I say Bethany is about 2 miles away. You have to go over the Mount of Olives. That's a little image of the Mount of Olives as you come out from Jerusalem towards Bethany. And that actually, all of these places, as we're going to see, they all play a part in the story. So, let's keep going. Yeah. So Friday night to Monday night, which we're looking at, Jesus is in Bethany. He's lodging, it seems, with Martha, Mary and Lazarus, although he does have a meal there at the house of a guy called Simon. But we're going to save that because it comes a little bit later in the story. So Jesus comes into Bethany. Here's the first place where I've brought this integrated text, so you can see how it works. The way it works, if you've not read the instructions that came with it, is each gospel is highlighted in a different colour. So words that are unique to one of the gospels are highlighted in that colour. Where a word appears in more than one gospel, I've put it in black. So you can see, if we put this first little kind of phrase together, having said these things, he went on ahead going up to Jerusalem. So all of that line is from Luke's gospel. Then, which I've taken from John's Gospel. Then it happened, that's from Luke again, because you can see what I've done. Luke, if you read it, having said all of these things, he went on ahead going up to Jerusalem. It happened, and I've inserted the word then from John's Gospel, because this verse from John's Gospel, which would have read, if you think of it like this, if you look at the gold, then 6 days before Passover Jesus came, but to make it read okay, I've put it into the sentence, just explaining how it all works. And then we've got the blue, which comes from Mark's Gospels, when they drew near to, and then several of the Gospels refer to him approaching Jerusalem. So when they drew near to Jerusalem. So that's probably going up to Jerusalem is probably the Jerusalem there is the same as the one in green above. So it's in Luke, it's in Matthew, I think, and in Mark. So it appears in black. So having said these things, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. So it happened that when he drew near to Jerusalem, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead, and whom he had raised from the dead, and to Bethphage, and to the Mount of Olives. So you see, as we look at this, John actually inserts in a little bit more about Jesus' base in Bethany. Some of the synoptic gospels we refer to them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tend to focus on Jesus arriving in Jerusalem. They mention Bethphage because Bethphage is important, because that's where Jesus picks up the donkey. And they mention the Mount of Olives because a lot of things are going to happen on the Mount of Olives, but they avoid mentioning Bethany and Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. For some of those of you who've worked through the things I've done elsewhere, you'll know that I'm very committed to the early church's understanding of when the Gospels were written. And in that context, actually, it makes sense because there's probably, as we'll see this as we go through, so I won't say too much now, there's probably a bit of pressure on that family, Mary, Martha, and Joseph, at the time that Matthew's Gospel is being written. And so as a result, he's probably fuzzed over that to not put them under pressure. So he's left them out. John's Gospel, which is written later, it's no longer an issue. So he's able to tell the story with a little bit more detail. But actually, it's one of those kind of little interesting questions because people will often think as you read them, there's an enormous importance that happens in Bethany, but the other Gospels, the first three, seem to kind of almost try to skirt around it. And so as I'm going to present is I think it's actually to do with the layer of persecution that is probably there at the beginning, which lifts after a little while. But we'll see some of that as we go through, just kind of highlighting where we're going. So it's Friday the 26th. It's 33 AD. I should have said that. I should have put that on the slide. I work with the date of 33 AD because it looks to me like a slightly better fit than 30 AD. There are various things you try to pull together when you're trying to work things out. Being someone who has a scientific bent, I give big lot of precedence to a certain astrological event that is referenced in the Gospels, which we now know happened in 33 AD. It was only worked out in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, when computer modelling of astronomical impacts happened, we actually kind of find that there's a very real event in 33 AD. So I tend to go for the 33 AD date. So in 33 AD, the Friday that Jesus arrives in Bethany is the 26th of... actually, it doesn't even say what month, does it? That's terrible. Friday the 26th. So it's the 26th of March when Jesus arrives. It's not when he arrives in Bethany. It's the 26th of March when he leaves Jericho. I put those little references there. You can kind of see from just before Jesus' arrival for the last week in Jerusalem, he's been there in Jericho. He's met Zacchaeus. He's healed the blind men on the road as he leaves out, and then he's kind of moved on out. So he's left Jericho. Now, it's 20 miles uphill, which if you're walking as an individual, particularly in the ancient world, in kind of the prime of your life, 20 miles is a day's journey. It's uphill, so it's a bit of a stretch. But of course, Jesus isn't travelling totally on his own. He's got a group of folks with him. So they leave on Friday the 26th from Jericho. They start heading towards Jerusalem. But he's got crowds. He's also got family members probably with him. Jesus seems to be on the pilgrim route. Although we don't get the references directly in the Bible, there is actually there's an interesting what's sometimes referred to as just trying to think where it's from. It's from one of the versions of what's known as the Gospel of Thomas, which is not that exotic a book. It's often presented as if some sort of mysterious about it, but actually fills in a little bit of details at Jericho, and it makes reference to various folks that are there. So it's not obviously in the gospel, so I don't have to incorporate it. But you kind of it is on the pilgrim route, and that makes sense. So they're probably members of Jesus's family who've come through via Jericho. So the last kind of part of the journey, they're going to head in. So he's probably got family members with him. There are crowds with him. There are perhaps even the blind men who've got healed kind of walking with him, and he's teaching as he goes. So I think we go. I actually put in, as they heard these things, he went up and told a parable. There's a lot more than just this. I'm just kind of illustrating, because he was near to Jerusalem. So it's all part of this same journey. They supposed that the kingdom of God would be revealed immediately. He said, look, a certain nobleman went to a far country to receive a kingdom for himself and to return. And he called 10 servants of his and he gave them 10 minor coins. So we've got this run of teaching that we read in Luke's gospel, that on the journey Jesus is kind of expounding. So you put all those things together, and it's not surprising that Jesus doesn't complete the journey on that first day as he leaves Jericho. So there we go. So as he's kind of heading up on that Friday, the evening falls, dusk comes, which I think, did I have it on the last slide? Let's just go back. No, I haven't. I thought I was intending. There are so many little bits I was intending to do. There you go. I put there's the clock. Okay, so let me go back. Okay, so as he's walking, dusk falls, which happens about 6:20 at this time of year, around Jerusalem. So, which actually means, of course, because of the way the Jewish calendar works, with the new day starting with dusk, with sunset, it now moves on to the Sabbath. So it's now what we think of as the Saturday, but it's in Jewish terms, it's the Sabbath day. So and that actually happens. It seems like before Jesus reaches Bethany. So Bethany is still more than 2,000 cubits away, which is about 3/4 of a mile. So it's not far necessarily away. But because it's Sabbath, and they're all traveling together, and we don't read of any desire here for Jesus to break Sabbath rules or anything like that. Jesus settles, and probably the teaching that we read about in Luke's gospel is continuing. So they make camp to observe the Sabbath. You can see that law is expressed. 2,000 cubits is a Sabbath day journey. So there you go, 6:20 on the clock in the corner. So when Sabbath is over, again 6:20 the next day. Of course, it's not far. It's only maybe a mile away at this stage, something like that. So after dusk, after around 6:20, the group gets up, and according to John's Gospel, it's 6 days before Passover when Jesus arrives in Bethany. So we kind of we'll look at the verse in a minute, but and I put here then the 6 days before Passover is a good opportunity to look at some potential problems in how we fit the Gospels together. And it's a good idea to try and resolve some of these before we go on too far. So I've put a quote from a reasonably well known. See, it's Cambridge Press Bible commentary. It's oldish now, 1938, but this was the view of P. Gardner Smith, who was a head of theology, I think at Jesus College, in fact. I think that's where he was. He makes this statement: no ingenuity can make the narration of Luke consistent with that of Mark, much less the fourth evangelist, with any of the synoptic writers. So that was his perspective as we look at the narration. He wasn't in the context of this is not the whole of the Gospels. It's very specifically the last week of Jesus' life, which is what we're looking at. He looks at it and says, when you try and put them together, you just can't do it. It's impossible. And that way of thinking, when it first kind of, to kind of give some context, which I think we need to kind of unwind from, is that there was a very cynical approach to the development of the Gospels about 200 years ago that came out of the German schools, where everyone assumed that the Gospels weren't written until 100 years or so after Jesus was born, and that was obvious because they needed 100 years or so because all those miracles that couldn't have really happened, we need time and people need to die off and the story needs to grow. So they came up with a theory that shoved the Gospels to being very late written, and they were written in different parts of the empire with different perspectives, and that's why they didn't always agree and didn't match up. This is the way the thinking went. Well, a lot of the assumptions that were made early on in that were eventually proved to be totally bogus. It turns out that actually the model that they were working for, the way in which stories grow over time, doesn't actually work, doesn't happen that way. And so as time went on as well, people kept finding scraps of the Gospels, which carbon dating would put earlier and earlier. And so it became less and less tenable to believe in late developing Gospels. So they settled on this kind of this view of the Gospels from about 70 onwards. But it's not necessarily what the early church thought about the Gospels. They all thought they were much earlier than that. They were written earlier. But they kind of came to that consensus. But actually, people kind of, by this time they had totally lost confidence in the narrative that had been handed down to us via the early church. So it's not that the early church don't sometimes say things that are contradictory, but the reasonable assumption people used to make was, well, they were kind of trying to fill things in. They didn't have kind of nice reference libraries and so on. They would sometimes make mistakes, but fundamentally they're trying to tell us the truth. But that kind of approach to the testimony of the early church got lost. And so now what happens is even good evangelical scholars, people who believe in the Bible, kind of believe it in a way in scholarship whereby we believe it because it's there in the Bible, but we don't believe any of the testimony around it. And so we come up with our theories as to why the gospel writer wrote the thing they did, or what they were trying to say. And those are all modern theories which we're kind of reading back onto the Bible. So I don't want to sound like I'm being overly critical of anyone, because I'm not really. I have great respect for people who spend time trying to understand the text and get behind them, because I think it's a really worthwhile endeavour. I think that the Lord speaks to you when you're trying to do it, and regardless of whether you come to the right conclusion sometimes. So I'm not trying to knock anyone in the process, but I've increasingly come to kind of say, actually, where possible, I want to kind of work with the testimony of the early church, because actually, as you put it together, it really does sort of make some sense, as we're going to see. But here's something to try and resolve. Here's one of the problems: 6 days before Passover. So as I say, if you spell out the problems, the four gospel accounts, when we're looking at the last week of Jesus' life, seem to name different people being in different combinations at different times. They're sometimes at the cross, they're at the tomb, or they're at the resurrection appearances. And here we've got, so we're going to need to establish some principles to try and keep careful track of the dates and times and the locations. We're going to try and have to get to know the various characters and their relationships, and even some of those who've got the same name, so we can track who's really happening, who's really doing it, who's really saying it. And we're encountering one of those moments now. Oh, look, I've got another of my meditation points. So I'll just go back here. We're encountering it now because John says 6 days before Passover. Okay. So we've said when that is, we put it together, but if you read on in John, suddenly they're having a meal for Jesus. But if you look in Matthew or Mark, they say 2 days before Passover, there's a meal. See, so here's one of those straightaways, one of those strange kind of mixes. Is it 6 days before, or is it 2 days before? So before we try and resolve it, I just wanted to put this little kind of get and say, like, okay, let's stop and think for a second. So how important is history to myth story? So remember I said sometimes you meet people for whom it's more that they love the truth of it, you know. So I love the truth. Christ died for the sins of the world. This is part of the, if you like, the myth. Doesn't mean it's not real. It just means that it means more than I can really get my head around. It's a kind of big and broad. History is all about I wake up in the morning, I do this, and so on. How important is it? And that's really actually, I think, it's a really important question to answer with nuance, because I think particularly as we're living in a world where there is a crisis of truth. I think, again, there's something about the mythological nature of the story of Jesus' crucifixion. Again, I'm conscious when I say that. I don't want anyone to hear me saying that I don't think... A myth isn't something that's not true. A myth is something that somehow means beyond what you think it means. But actually, within the story of Jesus, it's interesting and significant to me, that Jesus is tried by a judge who doesn't know what truth is. Pilate says, "What is truth?" We live in a time, and we live in a generation, we live in an age that doesn't know what truth is. If you talk to folks, they are genuinely confused on it. At every area, from the philosophies of science to understanding my identity and what makes me who I am, all of these things we're confused about nowadays. And so I think there is a place whereby, in one sense, that confusion has meant people they don't really care about whether the story of Jesus is historical or not, because they just think all of history is a myth anyway. So what I'm driving at is for us to stop and think, how important is it? Because when I have a conversation with someone, sometimes I might want to show them something that I think will astound them, but they don't believe any of it anyway. Other times I might think, well, they're not going to believe anything, and I don't show them something that would actually go, I've not seen something like that before. So there's something to get our heads around as to how do we present this story of Jesus. How much do when do we need to kind of present the history? When do we need to present the meaning? The meaning of the events. You get the kind of the gist of where I'm going. So I wanted to just kind of ask that question, because we're going to deal with the history bits and see that they're very solid. So some principles then for when we're harmonizing and when we're integrating the Gospels. One of the things that I think is really important for us to get our heads around when we're reading the Gospels and the Bible generally is we bring our cultural assumptions, and our cultural assumptions is actually been referred to, it's actually known in sociological terms as a weird culture. That stands for Western Industrial Educated, can't remember what the R is, something or other society. We're a weird culture. Our assumptions are actually quite unusual in terms of most of human history and most human places. One of the things that actually in the Western world for the last few hundred years has become so ingrained into us we don't see it, is we have very different chronological assumptions to most of most people who've lived through history. So I just want to explain a couple of those, because that's part of why we sometimes find it so hard to unravel the kind of the history of the Bible. Because we read certain things and we read them as very concrete because we have very concrete chronological assumptions. I remember in the watching the old Robin Hood film with Kevin Costner, and there's a bit where the sheriff of Nottingham says to somebody that he's going to see them at 10:15. And I remember when they said it, I thought, how ridiculous is that in the ancient world to say 10:15? No one would ever say it, would they? And because 10:15 is our assumption, is when I've got a clock that can show me minutes at a time. So chronology is thought and treated very differently. A lot of ancient texts are far more fuzzy with the way they present times and dates. So, for instance, ancient Hebrew itself doesn't make a distinction between past and present. They don't have past and present tenses. They have perfect and imperfect states, because actually time is less is less concrete. So they don't have that, and that was true of quite a lot of languages. In the modern world, nobody does that, because every language has to have past and present, because we're so time driven. So there's some things there which we'll see to make it less kind of fuzzy. We'll show you exactly what I mean as we get there. And related to that is, how do we therefore take the text and we turn it into a timeline? And so I talk about that when you have parallel events and you try and flatten them to tell a story. Because if I'm going to tell you a story, I have to tell you one thing, and then I tell you another thing, and I tell you another. So how have I flattened a 3D event into a kind of into a single timeline? So if I give you an example, supposing a few of us were together at a party somewhere, and so I come in and I go and join two other people, and they're already having a conversation, and I contribute a little bit, and then one of the three of us drops out, and the other two of us talk, and we finish the conversation. Now afterwards, I go home and my wife says, "Who did you see?" And I tell her, "Well, I had this conversation, and so was there, and so was there." But from my point of view, the conversation started after the point of view of the first person, and then that first person left, and so the conversation finished for them at that point. And as we try and blend all of those things together, when you've got full 3D events, there are various different ways you can sequence them. And the sequence, because we're very driven by time, we assume that the sequence is kind of chronologically precise, but it doesn't have to be. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that, because we'll see some of these things as we go through the text. We also have an instinct to what we think of as telescoping timescales. So often interesting things take place over several days. If I just tell you the interesting things that happened to me this week, you could probably fit them all into half an hour. And it's something about the way we're made that when we want to kind of fit things in right next to each other, so we squash them all up. Where in actual fact, sometimes they take much longer. And so actually part of what I found exciting and interesting is you kind of look at the Gospels in a more historical kind of way, is you start to realize that sometimes there's a sentence that's actually taken about a week to produce, to actually kind of work its way out. That the person has summarized what took over a week into kind of just a single sentence. But because of the way we again think, we kind of turn it into something tight and neat and pack them all up. So these are some of the principles. And then a very key one is that actually it's very common to find incompleteness in reporting the presence of characters. And that's not an issue. Just because someone says that somebody's not there doesn't mean they weren't there. They have different reasons for highlighting who might be there, but very often they won't necessarily list everybody. And as I say, an important presupposition is that I think the Church Fathers were fundamentally correct in their understanding of the who, the when and why of the four Gospels. So they were written by the people whose names they carry. They were written before the destruction of Jerusalem and in the order that we have them. That's my kind of summary of the basic position. Now, that's not the modern position, but I think this is actually a much more fruitful place to work from. It makes much more sense, as we see. Now to that key chronological problem, and you'll see how these things start to play out when I put this up. So the question is, was the Last Supper a real Passover meal, or was it not? And if we're going to solve this problem, we're doing this up front, it will actually help us solve several other problems too. So let me show you what I mean. So according to John's Gospel, Jesus is crucified on the day of preparation. The day of preparation is when the Passover lambs are sacrificed. So you sacrifice them the day before you eat them. See? So we read in John's Gospel, now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, this is Pilate, "Behold your king." So they cried, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So then he handed him over to be crucified. So Jesus is handed over to be crucified on the day of preparation for the Passover. And theologically, mythologically, that's really significant. You see, but historically, as we're going to see, it creates a bit of a problem. The reason why it's mythologically significant is that it means that Jesus is crucified at the same time as the Passover lambs are being crucified. See, but according to Matthew and Mark, the Last Supper was a real Passover meal, but it wasn't eaten until after the week of unleavened bread had started. Now, the thing is, we're not familiar with the practices and the culture of Jesus' day, so we don't always realize why this is a problem. So I've given you the quote from Matthew. "Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?' And he said, 'Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I'm keen to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. So Jesus is eating a real Passover, but it's already the first day of unleavened bread. And that's weird, really odd, because the Feast of Unleavened Bread doesn't start until the day after the day of preparation and after the Passover meal. It actually starts with the Passover meal. The Passover meal is the first meal of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, if that makes sense. So it's an odd thing. Matthew doesn't seem to make sense even in his own terms, but he's also saying that this is now happening after, and Jesus he's not only not yet eaten the Passover, but then he's got to be arrested and tried and then crucified. So we're kind of pushing a couple of days difference now between the story in John's Gospel and the story in Matthew and Mark, and actually in Luke as well. So don't worry, we are going to resolve all of these things. So the Last Supper was a real Passover meal, but it wasn't eaten until after the week of unleavened bread had started, as we said. So what's going on? So in the usual way of thinking, unleavened bread starts after, not before the Passover meal. One's before, one's after. So very often we kind of fudge it a little bit. We say, oh, well, like if I had to work a shift on on Christmas Day, I'd eat my Christmas dinner the day afterwards. It's not a big problem. But that isn't the way it works. That's a very kind of modern sort of approach. It's a single day that you kind of all pull together and you go and celebrate it. So Mark makes the problem even worse. So he puts on the first day of unleavened bread when they sacrificed the Passover. So Mark seems to be really confused here because he's saying that they sacrificed the Passover. When you sacrifice the Passover, that's the day of preparation. That's the very day that Jesus gets crucified. And on the day that Jesus is being crucified, Jesus' disciples are saying, where do you want us to go and prepare so you can eat the Passover? So I put that verse also appears in Matthew and Luke, but I've just given you it from Mark. Do you see what I mean when I said the chronological issues, why we've got to resolve them? So it's like saying on Boxing Day, the disciples asked where they should cook the Christmas turkey. That we would understand is something that needs explaining. It's not impossible, but we do need to explain it. How's it going to work? Actually, one of the things I can do, let me look at that. I can. Why is it not working? Oh, there we go. There you go. I've got rid of myself off the corner, so you can read everything there, and I'll put myself back. So there are these issues related to timing during Jesus' last week. I've given you an example here. We are going to look at it and solve it in a second, but there are more. So Jesus eats the Passover late during the week of unleavened bread, but he also dies at Passover, which happens before the week of unleavened bread. The three Gospels think that three of the Gospels think that the day of preparation is the same as the first day of unleavened bread, which it isn't. And they're unsure of when Jesus was anointed by Mary, because John's Gospel seems to imply it 6 days before, and yet Matthew and Mark say 2 days before Passover. So something's kind of odd is going on. And here's another interesting one, which we won't hit until later in the weeks as we go through. That it's actually been timed. There's not actually enough time for everything that happens to Jesus after he's arrested and when he's executed. Now that might seem like a kind of a fussy point, but people have actually run around Jerusalem with stopwatches to time how long it takes to get from one place to another. And will tell you quite confidently there is not enough time between Jesus' arrest and his execution. So it tells us there's something about the way we're bringing something of our understanding of chronology, our understanding of timekeeping and so on into the mix. And it does resolve quite nicely, so it won't be a fudge, don't worry when we get there. But it will help kind of illustrate something. So okay, here's a quick thought though, you see. Very often we just don't notice these things. Sort of saying, so my little meditation is, if we know it's true, then at what level is it important that we know how it's true? you see, the reason I mention that is one of the early times when I was trying to unravel some of these things, and I presented some stuff. I was doing a weekend away at Ashburnham, so I didn't know any of the people who had come. They were coming from different places, and there was a lady who had been through Bible college, who was getting angrier and angrier as the sessions went on. It was kind of it was a little bit awkward and embarrassing at one point. At one point, one of the other guests asked her to stop being so difficult, but she would, at one point she was banging her hand on the table saying, "But this gospel says this." I said, "Well, how do you fit the two together?" She said, "I don't have to. This one says that, and that one says that." Do you see that? And that approach is not uncommon. But if we're going to actually show that credibility of truth, if truth isn't going to become fuzzy, we need to understand somehow, not just that it is true, but how is it true? And that's what part of what we're doing over these next 6 weeks is seeing how the story of Jesus' Passion Week fits together in a way that makes sense and is consistent with the narratives that we have. So basically the Gospels are either confused or, and here's the beginning of the solution, there is more than one calendar being used. I put that there because that was the approach that a lot of people saw quite some time ago. I don't know if I've got it nearby. Years and years back, I got hold of a classic little book called Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ, which is really worth reading. I would really recommend it. I've changed my view on almost everything that's in there, almost, not quite. But the guy it was written quite a long while back. The guy who did it was very methodical in the way he approached how to kind of try and resolve things. And he presents on these issues, well, probably there's another calendar worth being used. But it was a kind of a probable. And I remember then famously, you'll see there's a famous Bible scholar by the name of F.F. Bruce, who in the 80s and in the introduction to his commentary on it must have been, I can't remember what it was on then, what his commentary was on. But you see it quoted all the time. It says, "There is no evidence for any other calendar than the standard Jewish calendar." Well, when he wrote that was true, but it's not true anymore. But you still hear that quote referenced. So I'm just saying it because we do actually now know some stuff about other calendars, as I'm going to show you. So, for instance, we know that there was an official temple calendar, which was a combination of lunar and solar. So the temple calendar that was run by the priests was a mix of lunar and solar together. And that's the kind of standard Jewish calendar, if I put it that way. There was the Essenes, who are a group. We're going to look at some of these folks in a minute, so I won't say too much about them. But the Essenes, who are often from a priestly caste, they saw the temple now as corrupt, and so they had rejected it totally, and they had replaced the temple calendar with a solar calendar. The solar calendar, a couple of popes ago, one of the popes resolved the issue of the calendars by suggesting that when Jesus ate his Passover, he was using the Essene calendar. The problem is, while we don't know exactly, what we do know is it was constantly slipping out because it's 364 days long. The temple calendar, over a period of 13 years, works out at 365.3 days over 13 years, if you add it all up, as you kind of adjust it and so on. So the lunar calendar kind of pretty much stays true with the solar cycles. The Essene calendar was slipping a day or so every year. And actually, as most people looked at the situation, they said that doesn't work because actually it was far too off. Passover, if Jesus was eating using the Essene calendar, he would be eating Passover in September time, so that doesn't really work. But it's there. It's a separate calendar. It's a different calendar that Jewish people were using in Jesus' day. The Samaritans had a slightly different calendar. Theirs was based on Israel's pre-exilic calendar. And there we have a little bit of a clue, something to spot. So there's this key event in the history of Israel that gives us the Bible. In fact, that pretty much the Bible comes to us because of various waves of invasion. So the Samaritans were the northern tribes of Israel who'd been conquered by the Assyrians. They pushed down, conquered the Assyrians, And a lot of the northern tribes gravitated into Judea and Jerusalem, and so Jerusalem became the centre for all of the tribes in one place. And the people who stayed behind intermarried with other nations and so on, and their faith got a bit blurred and mixed up. They maintained the Pentateuch and they kept Passover, but they kept it the way that they understood it was done before the exile. Then a later wave of invasions, the Babylonians came in and took they destroyed Jerusalem, and they took the Israelites out into exile. And when and actually in that first, between those two invasions, the Assyrians first, who took over the northern tribes, and then the Babylonians, who took those who were in Judea up into exile, the Bible, the Old Testament, was started. Jewish tradition tells us that Jeremiah was a key figure in collecting the text and the stone that were being brought into Jerusalem from the northern tribes. So he was bringing those things, he was putting those things together. And then when the exiles came back eventually and rebuilt Judea, finally that's when the Old Testament was completed under the temple at that point. So the Samaritans had bypassed all of that, and they just had, if you like, a somewhat corrupted, but kind of, they had their own they had a calendar which they saw as being the original calendar, the original Jewish calendar. We know that something changed in when the Israelites were in exile, because the names of their months changed. So that's one of the key things. Before Israel went into exile, the first month of the year was called Abib, but now it's called Nisan, which is the month of Passover. It's the first month of the religious year. It used to be called Abib, now it's called Nisan. The Nisan is actually the name that they brought back from being exiled into Babylon. It's the name of the Babylonian month. So now the Zealots, who we read about in the Gospels, who were real kind of hardcore super Pharisees in one sense, we know that they also celebrated, like we read about in Mark's Gospel and so on, they celebrated the first day of unleavened bread on Nisan the 14th, not Nisan the 15th. Now, why is that important? Well, that's because that is what, of course, Mark is saying when he says on the first day of unleavened bread, while they were preparing the Passover. You see, the two are the same. And actually we know, because of a reference to the Zealots, that they're doing exactly the same. So the Zealots seem to use a calendar like Mark does that has those two. So this is different from the official calendar. So I put a little question mark as what's the calendar being used in Galilee? And you know, there were lots of speculation around this, but it's really kind of been resolved a little bit more tightly in the last few years. Probably 15 or so years, but that's a few. So coming back to what's been called, it's actually been referred to as the most problematic verse in the New Testament. On the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover, his disciples asked, "Where do you want us to go and prepare the Passover?" So in the official Jewish calendar, which is used in Jesus' day and is also used by Jews today, that's impossible. It's impossible for those two things to happen at the same time. But actually we know that it is possible in other calendars. Okay. See, Nisan the 14th is the day of preparation. The lambs get slaughtered during the daytime. Then nightfall comes, which means it's now Nisan the 15th, and Passover is eaten after sunset. So we would think of it as being the same day, but in the religious Jewish calendar, it's transitioned a day. So it's technically the next day, Nisan the 15th. You can't be, the synoptic gospel writers can't be using the official Jewish calendar. But actually saying on the first day of unleavened, oh yeah, I think I've done this, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. It's like saying on Boxing Day when people wrap their presents, the disciples asked, "Should we stuff the turkey?" I think I put a quote like that in earlier. So we've seen that. So what we do know is there must be another calendar being used, one that's obvious to all of the writers of the synoptic gospels, that makes sense to Mark. And in fact, an author who concocts this story It's very difficult to do once Judea has been invaded by the Romans, Jerusalem has been destroyed, and they've been dispersed everywhere, because at that point it seems the knowledge of these other calendars has got lost. They were being used locally. In Jesus' day, the gospel writers use them without bothering to explain that they're using them, because they assume everybody knows. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, we lose that knowledge and it disappears. So an author concocting, if you're going to concoct the resurrection events after the destruction of the temple, the only calendar that's now being used is the official one. So you would never say something like this. So in a funny way, it shows that these were written before the destruction of the temple. So the calendar that we're going to have to look for is one that runs from dawn to dawn, which is what the Zealots calendar seems to do, the Samaritan calendar does, or midnight to midnight, like the Roman calendar. It's likely that the Zealots calendar is the same as the Samaritan calendar, which is also likely to be the same as the calendar that's being used by Jews in Egypt, because we'll show you why. Here's the big reveal. You see, we're pulling the curtains back. we're tearing the veil. If you like that little effect, you can guess what we're going to use when we get to that part of the story. So we're going to resolve the calendars. Sorry if this has been a bit dull and tedious, but so before the exile, there was a different Jewish calendar in use, and it's based on the Egyptian lunar calendar, which runs from sunrise to sunrise. And we actually see that the Bible actually tells us this is the case if you read it carefully. See, it says in Exodus 12:2, God says to Moses, this month they're leaving Egypt. So as they're leaving Egypt, God says to them this month. Now, the only context they have for this month is the calendar that's being used in Egypt. So it's the Egyptian month. It shall be the first month of the year to you. So God instructs them and says that the only change I'm making to the calendar is it's actually the 7th month when they leave. And he says, this is going to be your first month. So the month of Abib will no longer be the 7th month, it's going to be the first month. And the Israelites go on out and they continue to use the same names that they were using before, but now it's the first month starts on what used to be the 7th. So God instructs them to number the months from the time of the first Passover in the Exodus, but he doesn't make any other modification to the calendar whatsoever, which is how we can suddenly start to unravel this, because there is a difference. The Egyptian calendar is the same as the Babylonian calendar in that it's a solar lunar. It's using the sun and the moon, except for one difference. So it seems that the Jews who hadn't been exiled up into Babylon, or because like they're the Zealots, they really want us to be totally kind of committed to the original situation. And the Essenes looked at what's been going on in the temple and they said, well, you've made some changes to the calendar, we'll just change ours as well. So it seems that those who are, there's a kind of a sense of, if you like, a kind of getting back to basics. Says we're going to stick with what it used to be. The Samaritans, the Galileans, the Zealots, maybe the Essenes, some of the Essenes even probably are continuing to use this calendar that had been adopted and adapted from what they used in Egypt. It's also interesting to note, of course, Jesus spends his early childhood years in Egypt. And the difference with this calendar is that it's based not on the month changes, not when the moon disappears, which is what happens in the Jewish calendar. When the moon disappears, you say, "Oh, it's the end of the calendar month." But this one starts when a new moon appears. So in actual fact, there's a couple of days difference all the time between the official Jewish calendar and perhaps their original calendar that they used. So the dates are numbered from the old moon disappearing, not when the new moon appeared. And that can vary between 1 and 3 days, just depending on the cycles of the moon and the sun, compared with if you're using sunset to sunset to measure your calendar. And it seems that provided a relatively useful way when 2 million people turned up or up to 2 million. It may not be as many as that. That's what Josephus says, but it's probably smaller than that. But when 1 million people turn up for Passover, you've got to sacrifice an awful lot of lambs awfully quickly. It helps if you can spread it out a little bit. Is that making sense? Because then you can manage these things a little better. And actually, as it turns out, in AD 33, the month of Nisan, it's all now called Nisan, they all call it Nisan, starts 1.5 days earlier in the original calendar than it did on the official calendar, the temple calendar. So in practice, that meant that there were 2 days difference between the two. So there are 2 days difference. So as a conclusion, so it seems that Matthew, Mark and Luke, when they're reporting, they are probably reflecting something of the kind of away from Jerusalem culture. They are using, it seems, that original calendar. So Galilean Passover lambs are being sacrificed on the same day as the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts, because in the original calendar, you got to the evening and nighttime was the same day as during the day. So you sacrificed the lamb, evening came, then you ate the lamb. So you did both on the same day. The day of preparation, the day of Passover, and the first day of unleavened bread all happen on the same day. Whereas John is kind of writing from a Jerusalem perspective, and he seems to be using the official temple calendar, which runs sunset to sunset. And in that calendar, Jesus does die with the Passover lambs, just as they're being slaughtered. So that was a rather long way of kind of solving a kind of a key problem. Oh, here you go. Here's a little bit of a. What it actually means, though, as we're going to put this week together, is that actually the Last Supper happens on a Wednesday, not on a Thursday. It's Maundy Wednesday, not Maundy Thursday, if I put it that way. Because that is official Passover day for the original Jewish calendar. And if you remember back to that list of some of the problems we've got, that solves another problem. Because suddenly we have a little bit longer for Jesus' trial to take place, with all of the comings and goings, being sent to different places, Annas' house, the Sanhedrin, Pilate, Herod's palace, back to Pilate. All of those different movements suddenly don't have to happen in about an hour at a time. They actually have a longer period to happen over. So we're going to explore and see some of that, how that happens. So first kind of big conclusion is we're working towards Wednesday as the Last Supper. So I put these are in, I think, in the one of the sets of notes that have come with you. If you want to try and visualize it as we kind of work through, you got the Gregorian calendar. The Romans use what we think of as the Julian calendar, which runs midnight to midnight. We've copied them. So as we're looking at kind of the dates, Nisan the 14th, which is the day of preparation, that's going to fall on April the 3rd, which is a Friday in our calendar. In the official calendar, obviously it's going to run from 6 p.m. The night before through to 6 p.m. on the day, whereas in the Galilean calendar, it's all shifted a little bit. So it starts. The day of preparation is actually, you can see a full day's clearance ahead, so nearly 2 days ahead. So back to Bethany. So that we've actually seen a really important thing, because we're going to use that as we run through the text. So we have to remember that as we're going through, that they're working on slightly different time scales. So Jesus arrives 6 days before the official Jewish Passover, where he lodges with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So let's just go. One of the other things we're going to need to do is just get to understand and know who some of the people are in this story. So I'm going to not introduce everybody tonight. We're going to be doing some each week as we go through. So Martha, we really only know about Martha through Luke's Gospel, and this reference here in John. But we have these extra stories in Luke's Gospel. But she's actually remembered as being what they call the myrrh bearer by the Orthodox Church, despite not being named as such in the Gospels. So when we read the Gospels, remember we saw that principle that they don't necessarily list everybody who's present. So somehow, for some reason, the Orthodox Church, I'm just going to take a drink for a second. The Orthodox Church remembers her as being someone who goes to the tomb with myrrh, and actually encounters Jesus, remember, on the road back as they're carrying the message of his resurrection. They refer to them as the myrrh bearers. Martha actually means mistress, and as we look at the story in Luke's Gospel, she seems to be kind of head of the household. So she seems to be the oldest, perhaps, and her name actually means mistress, which also tells us a little bit that the family is probably wealthy. So it's the kind of name you give to someone who's actually likely to be in a position of authority. And they, as I say, in Luke's gospel, they seem to be hosting Jesus and his disciples. So she obviously has access. Lazarus is likely, as the boy, to be the one, but he may not be old enough at this stage, you see, which is why it's so tragic that he dies. He may not be old enough to have taken the inheritance, so she seems to be managing it at this stage during Luke's gospel. Catholic tradition tells us that the family is wealthy and has property in Galilee as well as Judea. So if that is the case, if she also has property in Galilee, she might be one of the unnamed Galilean women that we do read about being there as witnesses to the crucifixion. So Martha is a key character. According to Catholic tradition as well, Jesus has actually healed her of a 7-year flow of blood. Obviously, it's not in the Gospels, but that's the kind of thing that you expect. There are lots of times in the Gospels he says he healed everybody. And if she is one of the women that's followed Jesus from the time in Galilee, very often those people would have been impacted in some way. So you can understand that. So perhaps make some little bit of colour and some sense. I've tried to use a different character for each one so we can trace them as we go along. So Mary, now Mary is more complicated, and I'm not going to try and resolve it all tonight. But I'm just going to say I'm going to treat Mary of Bethany as the same person as Mary Magdalene. I say we will explore the why elsewhere, probably when we look at Tuesday night. The Catholic tradition does exactly the same. It assumes that she's the same person. Strangely, though, Orthodox tradition treats Mary of Bethany and Mary of Magdalene as two separate people. But the funny thing is they still recognise Mary of Bethany as being a witness of the resurrection. So in one sense, if we're trying to tell the story, we don't lose too much by blending the two together, if I can put it that way, because they're both witnesses. But actually, I think there are other reasons for understanding Mary Magdala or Mary of Magdalene as being the same person. Obviously, the name Mary of Bethany is never actually given to her. It's just we flag her that way because we meet her in Bethany all the time. Whereas the Magdalene would imply that Mary has come from the town of Magdala in Galilee. Well, of course, if the family does own property in Galilee, there's not a problem if the two are the same. But I think much more likely, if the two characters are the same Mary, is that the Magdalene is actually more of a nickname that is probably used to obscure her identity, and it therefore is established in Matthew's Gospel. So he's known as the Magdalene. So Mary Magdalene, sometimes called the Apostle to the Apostles. She's a really key witness, of course, to the resurrection, because she's recognised as the first person to actually be sent, which is what the word apostle means, to be sent by the resurrected Jesus. So she's apostle to the apostles. She's commissioned by Jesus to go and take the message to them before any of them are commissioned to take it out to the rest of the world. So in that sense, she has a towering kind of role. The word Magdalene, actually, Magdala is a tower. That's why I say. And the Gospels always don't refer to her just as kind of Mary of Magdala. They refer to her as Mary the Magdalene. So it's why I think it sounds a little bit more to me like a nickname and maybe a deliberate way of slightly hiding who she is, because we'll see why, because it becomes part of the story in a minute. As we move on, then Lazarus. I suspect, as we just kind of infer from putting the stories together, that Lazarus is the younger brother, which is probably why it seems so tragic when he dies. If he is still young, he's not yet inherited the family's wealth, because it seems that Martha seems to be administering at that level at this stage. According to Orthodox tradition, Lazarus gets forced to leave Bethany after Stephen's martyrdom. Okay. Which is possibly during the persecution of Agrippa, because of the threats on his life. Now, if you try and put together when Matthew was written, if we take into account the things that the early church tell us about how things happened, when people have moved on and so on, Matthew's gospel is actually being compiled for the Hebrew church, the Jewish church, almost from the day of Pentecost, and is really coming together at the very time when Stephen is getting martyred, and during the persecution of Herod Agrippa. So it would make sense not to say the Mary who's such a key figure is this lady who's part of a family who's lived just down the road from Jerusalem, and you can go and find them, because the tradition is he has to leave because Lazarus is under threat because he has been resurrected by Jesus, and is kind of quite a local celebrity. So we don't want to draw attention to him. So you can understand perhaps why she kind of sneaks in with this other name, but you get those references to her fame being everywhere because of what she does, the anointing. But that's Mary of Bethany. But actually the woman who's the really famous woman is Mary Magdalene. See why I put them that way. If you want to go with them being separate characters, as I say, it's not too drastic to the way we're going to resolve things, but I think they work well together on this occasion. One of the things we know about Lazarus is that because he has to leave under the persecution, because he is kind of under death threats, he leaves with Martha, but Mary stays. See, which would again make sense of why they've perhaps given her a separate name. First of all, for people coming into the church, they won't know who Lazarus and Martha are anymore because they're not around. And secondly, she's the only one that's left, so she's the one whose identity we need to fuzz up a little bit, you see. So eventually Mary does go to Cyprus, which is where Lazarus and Martha are, where they actually join Paul and Barnabas, who make Lazarus the leader of the church there. That doesn't necessarily mean when the first time Paul and Barnabas go. It could have been when Paul is based in the Aegean visiting various places, and we know there's a church that grows in Cyprus. So both Orthodox and Catholic tradition tell us that this family end up, certainly Martha and Lazarus, but that they end up in Cyprus. They get there slightly differently. The Orthodox tradition sounds more like real history. The Catholic tradition is they kind of set off in a boat without a rudder, and it just kind of takes them there, which kind of sounds a little bit like one of those stories, doesn't it? But the fact is, in both traditions they arrive at the same place, and interestingly. I say interestingly, in AD 890, a tomb was discovered in Larnaca with the inscription "Lazarus, a friend of Christ," and in 1970 they actually found there was a fire actually revealed kind of concealed and protected ossuary of bones, relic remains. So there's good evidence in one sense that Lazarus really does end up as leading the church in Cyprus. But it's important, as we say, this family is going to play a key role as the time goes on. So I just wanted to get to know them a little bit as we start tonight. So if we go back to Bethany, if I put it this way, John's account of the events flows thematically more than chronologically. So he says, they made him a supper there. This is John 12:9. That's not 12:9, it's 12:2. Sorry, that's an incorrect Bible reference there. That should say John 12:2. I don't know why it's got 9. I probably wasn't typing correctly. That's probably the reason. They made so it says Jesus arrives 6 days before Passover, so they made him a supper there. That phrase, you see, we read it because of our chronological assumptions. Is Jesus turned up and straight away they made a supper for him. Okay. But actually, in the ancient world, which is less kind of driven by clocks, it just simply says he arrives in Bethany, and while he's there, effectively is what it means. It doesn't say the immediate thing they do. It's just so they made him a supper there. And what he's doing is he introduces us to the anointing passage, which isn't going to happen till later in the week, so we're not going to cover it in detail here. But it does help us to explain. It introduces to us Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, who's there in Bethany. Because John is going to highlight to us that actually the involvement of Lazarus with Jesus while he's at Bethany causes great excitement in the crowds. So here's where the 9 comes in, verse 9. This is where the verse 9 comes in. So because a large crowd learned that he was there, i.e. Jesus, and came, not just for Jesus' sake, but to see Lazarus as well. So, here is this miracle worker that stories have been spreading out through the diaspora, wider than just Judea, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, Galilee, but right the way down into Egypt, where there's an enormous Jewish community, all the way down into Arabia, where there's a pretty big Jewish community, up into Anatolia and up into areas even on the edges of Ukraine, which was very kind of in the news at the moment. There are Jewish communities in all of these places, and the stories have been spreading out. They've heard about the healer, and the story of the resurrection of Lazarus has been a really big one, which is why we so regularly find in the early church testimonies the thing we're going to read in John's Gospel, that Lazarus' life is under threat because he's an embarrassment to the authorities that have killed Jesus. And there's now the claim of his resurrection, and there's somebody still around who himself was dead and was raised by Jesus. You see the way the testimony creates that rippling effect. But in John's Gospel here, that's part of the draw that bring the crowds in to find out, that makes the word spread. You have both the healer and one of his most famous healing testimonies all together. Which explains as you go on, the chief priests, therefore, same verse, conspired to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many Jews went away and believed in Jesus. Now, this commentary is by John after the resurrection, during the very period, that we're thinking about in one sense, where Lazarus has to leave because he's threatened. So we have it here in the Gospels that actually there's this ongoing threat to Lazarus, which probably explains why they don't appear in the early Gospels. So let's get familiar with some places now. So we've got some people in place. We're getting to kind of put some faces behind some of those names. I always find that helps. You've got something to imagine, a face to imagine. We're also going to need to kind of understand the places to some degree as well. So outside the city, there's the Mountain of